Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. Today's presentation is about the finishes of the modern building, and it will be presented by Fadlallah Dagher, an architect, member of BHI that has been a militant. He's been fighting for the heritage preservation for more than 30 years. Fadlu.
Thank you, Yasmin. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon for this presentation. I will be talking today about the 20th century architecture, mainly between the 1920 and the 1960s, which we call transitional and modernist heritage. It has been presented as a general notice by Naji Asi. And I will be talking today about the materials that were used in this specific period and on this specific type of architecture. Before starting, I would like just to inform you, in case you don't know, that BHI has issued the first manual for the restoration of historical heritage buildings of Beirut, the Beiruti Houses Restoration Manual, 1860-1925. This is a manual that is practically synthesizes all the presentations that we have done. Actually, it was written in parallel with the presentations, and it is available free online on the BHI site. So all you have to do is just connect to the BHI website and you can get all a PDF version, download it easily. Otherwise, if you would like a printed version, it's available at the BHI premises at Cecine Square. Just for information, this manual is today available in French and English, and it's under print in Arabic as well. And it will be followed by another manual which will present the modernist and transitional architecture later. So I will start with my presentation right now. Okay, so we're talking today about the finishing materials in the modernist domestic architecture in Beirut between 1925 and 1970. This is a presentation on these materials, which will of course be consistent with whatever materials were and how were these materials available, what did the architects do with it, how did they use it, and the main purpose of this is really to present different styles in this specific era in the history of Lebanon. Now, before starting, I need just to point out that the heritage is really a notion that is not yet well embedded in the local culture and local history. Up until today, as you know, the only legal frame that is applicable is the Antiquities Law, which specifies that each and every building that is built before 1700 is considered as being antiquities and therefore heritage. However, nothing later on is heritage unless decided so by the Directorate of Antiquities. And so heritage and antiquities have been linked in the mind of people for a very long time. And there has been a lot of work since the 1990s to identify and really bring to light whatever we call heritage. And the latest attempt was some years ago, 5 to 6 years ago, when Mr. Araiji was Minister of Culture, and Abdul Halim Jabber and I produced then what we call the heritage map, which somehow tried to identify clusters, larger clusters of heritage buildings, which were incorporating not only the late Ottoman buildings, but as well the early modern architecture. And well, so up until today, there is no specific criteria. Whenever we talked about the thing, people say, okay, what's your criteria to consider this as heritage? And I would like just to point out that, for instance, in a country such as the United States of America, there is no law to protect heritage. However, everything that is older, every building that is older than 50 years is considered as being heritage. So for us today, we're in 2021, we can consider that anything that was built prior to 1970 can be considered as heritage. Is it then afterwards, each and every building would have to be looked at in detail to specify if it's really worth of being preserved or modified or amended or simply replaced by something new. However, this Beirut Heritage Map, what it shows that really what was the purpose and what was our conviction, and is still our conviction today, the only way to look at heritage in terms of preservation is from an urban vision. With an urban vision, you can definitely try and preserve heritage. Otherwise, there's no use in preserving each and every building, because the debate has been on for 30 years, and on each and every building, the debate is, and it's still today, what are the criteria to consider this building as a monument? And what we are advocating for is really not to preserve buildings as monuments, but buildings as an urban fabric. So this is what is more important. And sometimes, many times, it's not really important whether the building is to be preserved as it is and as it looks in detail. However, it's more important in terms of relationship with the neighborhood. This is why really we should focus on the urban fabric rather than just simple individual buildings. And it will take, of course, to renovate those buildings or to intervene on those buildings, it takes a lot of sensibility. It takes very little ego. And this, I need to say it, because if we consider that we're working on a building that is worth being restored, it means that we as architects, as restorers, we should be really very, we should work with a lot of humility on those buildings and do whatever needs to be done. For the buildings that were built between 1925 and 1970, definitely there's a lot to be done. Why is so? Because those buildings, of course, have practically all the infrastructure that is outdated. Electricity, plumbing are definitely not worth today of being restored. And it has to be changed anyway because it has suffered through time. We're talking about buildings that are more than, today they are 50 years old, but some are 100 years old. So the infrastructure is really in a poor condition, and it definitely should be upgraded. And to upgrade it, there is no logic at all to upgrade electricity as it was installed in the 1920s and 1930s. It has definitely to be up to date with new systems. Same applies to waterproofing, same applies, of course, to other technological parameters. And this is to say that today, anything that should be done on these modern heritage buildings could be done in a not necessarily really by preserving each and every feature as it is or as it was, but really working more on the spirit of those buildings than on the specific detail. So we don't need today to restore each and everything as it was done 100 years ago, because this is modern technology, and we will see why and how. A little historical overview to start with. So, of course, 1918, end of WW1, and as soon as it's ended, the Bauhaus is established in Dessau, Germany, in 1919. 1920, Lebanon is under French mandate, and the Republic of Greater Lebanon is initiated. In the 1920s, European and local engineers and architects educated at the Beaux-Arts introduced the Portland cement technology to the Levant region, in Lebanon, in Palestine, under British mandate, and of course, Syria, Iraq, etc. So all the buildings in all the countries in the Levant are formed or are introduced with the Portland cement, which is a new technology. Just for info, it was created, invented, developed in the second half of the 19th century, specifically in Switzerland. One of the major inventors of Portland cement is Freycinet, who designed bridges with the Portland cement. But then after World War I, it was the technology to rebuild Europe, and it was used as a technology also in the other regions of the world, specifically, of course, in Lebanon. In 1925, we have another major event, which is the Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes, which we call Art Deco, and it introduced at the same time the Art Deco style, which is still a decorative style, yet more simple with linear lines, more simple than the classical Beaux-Arts. And in parallel, two very daring and simplistic models, which are the Soviet Union Pavilion by Melnikov and Le Corbusier Pavillon de l'Esprit Nouveau, which were at the same exhibition of the Art Deco. 1929, the first cement factory is established in Lebanon, in Sheka, La Société des Ciments Libanais, SCL. We used to call it here Al-Al'a because the 6 columns of the Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek were the logo on all the bags of this company. Today it's Holcim. So it's this is the first factory in Lebanon. And of course, once this factory was established, it was even more easy to spread the reinforced concrete technology. 1932, one of the first modern buildings in Beirut, major buildings in Beirut, which is Hotel Saint-Georges. Some early modernist buildings were built before. 1936, Lebanon is represented at the Foire du Levant in Palestine with the Lebanese pavilion in Tel Aviv, actually, and you see it on the picture to the right. In 1943, Lebanon is an independent country, and of course, economical growth and prosperity and the new face of this new country, new independent country, has to be expressed in cement with modernist architecture. And the 1950s will see the building of the first commercial center, the Starco, the Shell building on Rauche, as well as Hotel Phoenicia on the seafront. Of course, all of this era started in 1920 with the French Mandate and the late Ottoman legacy. So for some time during the 1920s and the first half of the 1930s, the central hall plan will still be used. And of course, with its major feature on the facade, which are the 3 arches. Here we see a picture taken in 1920 of the Rue Bourreau-Gemayzé, where we see the building of the Procure des Frères, which is still a building still existing today. It was under construction, and we see that the construction is pretty much similar to whatever was used during the Ottoman times. Of course, we're still in 1920, and the technology hasn't changed. However, some details are introduced in this building, which are the balconies, as you can see on the picture to the right bottom. The corner balcony, for instance, this is something totally new to address corner. And the cone shape of this balcony has nothing to do with the traditional corbels and marble slabs of Beirut. It's much more a structure that is a little bit more elaborate, which is introduced by actually the new era, which is the Beaux-Arts. We can see also the podium, the first floor, the ground floor of the building, which is done like simile stones. And for some time, all the domestic architecture in Beirut, for 15 years practically, will follow the criteria of the late Ottoman period, which is residential buildings around the central hall with 3 arches on the facade, and little by little, those 3 arches that you can see here at the ground floor will evolve into one large arch or into more rectangular, square angles, windows, but still with the same typology. One major thing that will happen in these days is the addition to the central hall buildings, addition of a larger veranda to the north, which is a very huge actually balcony. Instead of having the simple 1 meter, 1.5 meters balcony outside the north facade, we will see appearing the large balcony, large verandas on concrete columns. As for the finishing materials, we're still in the plastering of the sandstone. So the sandstone of the walls is still plastered in the late Ottoman period, and it will start like this in the early 1920s, but with plastering that will sometimes imitate the stone, or sometimes the frames, the jambs of the windows and the doors will still be in solid stone from Mansouriya. So we see here that this architecture of the late Ottoman period will still be here early on in the 1920s. And little by little, new materials are introduced. Those new materials are, of course, the bricks that are imported from Europe. It's not fabricated here. Little by little, there will be some bricks that will be manufactured in Lebanon, mainly by the Müller factory. But in the 1920s, it was introduced through the port of Beirut, imported from Europe. And the cement masonry units, CMU, which will be prefabricated and will complement construction. We will use this as a replacement for the famous Ramleh sandstone. And instead of Ramleh sandstone, we will use cement blocks that will be all molded, all cast with specific shapes and specific dimensions. Thus, it will be very easy to construct with it. And these materials will be, of course, plastered or not plastered with cement plaster and then lime washed. And of course, the major innovation here is the reinforced concrete, which is introduced, as we said, as soon as 1920. Imported first, the cement was imported first, and then as soon as 1929, the cement factory is existing in Sheka, and we're producing locally. So the slabs first will use reinforced concrete, and then little by little, of course, the elevations, the facades, etc. The whole building will be using this. And what's interesting is that starting from 1925 up to, of course, the period we're talking to, and up until today, the buildings, the frames, the walls, the structural grid, the slabs, everything is done in reinforced concrete. However, in the 1920s, 1930s, not only the structure was made out of reinforced concrete, but all the decorative elements, all the aspect of the building will be done with cement. The cement is basically the only source of producing materials. These materials will be manufactured or produced on site using cement. As you can see also, there is some new influence, stylistic influence, which comes from the Beaux-Arts. The picture to the left shows you a building on Gouro Street, Jemaise, which is built in 1926. The Tadros building, the facade is all in stone from Mansouriya, but worked in a different style, a new style which is more European, as you can see, the balustrades, etc. However, the construction is still in the traditional manner. We have stone corbels popping out of the facade, marble balconies, but the angles are not arched anymore. The windows are not arched anymore. It's practically straight angles with some carving on the facades, which is inspired and from the Beaux-Arts and looks very much like some Parisian buildings. And the picture to the right shows you a building that is plastered. So it's not solid stone. The facade is not in solid stone. It is plastered, but it's a building that is also on Gouro Street, Jemaise, and really totally within the Beaux-Arts system. Then, of course, as we said, in 1925, Exposition des Arts Décoratifs, so the Art Deco is introduced. And in Beirut, the Art Deco will be the first real occasion to use this new technology of reinforced concrete and cement plaster and cement molding, as you can see, for instance, on this building, where the whole decoration is made out of cement. So it's very simple in terms of material. There is no mixing of materials. Everything is done of concrete and cement. However, the decoration is highly worked on with molded plaster and molded elements. The Art Deco facades are using a typology based on this new Art Deco decoration, which is based on geometric forms. Of course, it doesn't. It's not applied strictly on each and every building. Sometimes you have a mix with little by little. The typical forms of Beiruti architecture will go simpler and simpler in a more geometric pattern. But however, the materials that we see here, the facade materials, are just plaster and color wash. Sometimes a lime wash, so lime is mixed. It's white lime or lime mixed with ochre powder to give it this yellow color. And actually, all the buildings of the 1920s and 1930s has been called les maisons jaunes by some social historian here in Beirut, because these maisons were all jaune. All these houses were yellow, painted with this lime wash of ochre, melt with water and lime, and the buildings were painted with this. As we can see, it's practically long-lasting colors. Of course, these colors have faded a little bit in time. However, what we see is clearly that it's all the same technology. So the building was totally plastered. There is no apparent stone in the building, just cement plaster, because this was new and this was really the technology that was à la mode. So again, other examples of these Art Deco facades, molded cement and plaster and color wash. As you can see on all these pictures, the molded elements are sometimes very elaborate. On the central picture, for instance, you see this building with ionic columns. Of course, it's totally classical, inspired by again, the Beaux-Arts. It's not absolutely Art Deco, it's a little bit ambiguous. While the building to the left of your screen and the detail on the right of your screen are absolutely Art Deco, as you can see on the balustrades and on the balconies. But still, the finishing is all plaster and lime. And because the cement and the reinforced concrete are molded, are cast within wood casting, sometimes some buildings had the facade cast out really with molded cement. So the molding was fabricated in a way that once we take it off, the facade will be molded out in solid concrete, solid cement and concrete, as you can see on this picture of this building in Bashura. Of course, one major element of this Art Deco period are the balustrades, the molded reinforced concrete balustrades, which were prefabricated. It was not cast in situ. It could have been cast in situ. However, it was prefabricated on the side and then assembled on site. And the guardrail was then poured on top of it in order to hold them together. So all of this is done with this very new, flexible, and exceptional material, which is the cement and reinforced concrete. When I say exceptional, etc., I mean it the way it must have appeared at the time, because instead of bringing in stone and stone masons and all of this, everything could be done out of this cement and reinforced concrete, and it looked like really something extremely solid, monolithic, so that would stand the test of time, would be here forever in their idea. And even then, the red tile roofs were abandoned because those concrete slabs were really resisting to water. And we know today that it's not waterproof. We know today that we need, of course, other layers of waterproofing to protect it and other things. However, at the time, it was really the new material. They didn't know that at one point metal would rot. They didn't know at the time that the metal, once it's oxidated, would gain in volume and affect the cement by causing cracks, etc., etc. So all the buildings at the time were built in the same material and the same technology because it was easy, It was efficient, time efficient, and cost efficient. And really, with that, they were able of producing any type of design they wanted. But you can see here, for instance, in this balustrade, how this modular balustrade was assembled. And once, of course, the top beam has disappeared, the modules are not held together anymore, and they could fall down. Now, of course, in parallel with the Art Deco, little by little, we see also the new Bauhaus ideas popping in the buildings and going to more simplistic designs, round balconies, because concrete, cement being flexible materials, we can do anything, any shape we want with it. And so we see here, for instance, the round balconies that start to appear, popping out of the building, balconies all along the facade, because we're not here anymore constrained with the corbels and the marble slabs. It's going to be one slab connected to the interior slab popping out of the building, and little by little, of course, it will gain more and more in importance because the technology allows it and because the climate also allows it, because the veranda, the balcony, is a place, is a space where one will definitely be sitting much of the year. 9 months over the year, the balcony is the place to be in Lebanon, in Beirut, in the 1930s. Now, the two images you see in the center and to the right look very much the same, probably built by the same engineer. Those buildings had the same gate, the same awning on top of the gate. One, of course, has the central staircase. The other one doesn't show the central staircase, but you see the balconies also with these stepped thicknesses on the bottom of the slab show how really they also used the concrete in its more efficient way. So they did not use more, because more at the time was a lot of money. They really cast the concrete in the most efficient way to have the thinner slab possible at the edge. We have to note here that the slabs were all made out of solid slab, probably between 12 and 15 centimeters thick, with one layer of steel. So really very, very light slabs, practically, compared to what we are building today. And as we were saying, so the round and curved shapes start to be implemented in Beirut on the corner of the streets, of course. But here we have this building that is totally curved with balconies, round balconies popping out of it. And the finishing, again, here, the finishing is always and is still just cement plaster on the facade and then a lime wash with some ochre color. As you can see, all these buildings have the same color. All these buildings are of this yellowish color, which allows us to date it to the 1920s and 1930s, late 1920s and 1930s, definitely for both these buildings. As you can see on the right, the window is still a window, very classical window with the shutters, abat-jour shutters in the typical Beiruti system. However, to the right, there is an expression of horizontality with lines on top and bottom of the windows, connecting all the windows together to give the impression that we are here in a Corbusier building with the fenêtre horizontale, horizontal window all along the building. Now, this very smooth first render of the facades, which is typical of the 1920s, 1930s era, will soon be abandoned because, of course, it needs maintenance. Of course, it's a little bit poor, and we will see how the architects and engineers of the late 1930s and 1940s will start introducing new ways of treating this cement. Of course, Tyronian plaster, which is a very easy material, will start being used, and it is also not only used as it is, but it's sometimes worked with a trowel in order to smoothen the surface, not having pieces popping out of the facade. This typical Tyrolian troweled finish is typical of many Beiruti houses of the late 1930s and definitely all the 1940s. However, as you can see, the colors are still the ochre color, yellowish or pinkish, little pinkish, which is obtained by crushing gravel into a very smooth powder that is mixed with the cement and then projected on the facade with the Tyrolian machine, which is a very simple machine. This, of course, ugly plastic thing, I've found it on internet. I don't have one of the ones that was used at the time, which is made out of wood. It's a wood box with just projecting system to project this on the facade, and then you have a second team that will come and apply the trowel in order to have a smooth finish, which looks like patches on this Tyrolian finishing. And as you can see, these early modernist and Art Deco buildings were finished with these materials. It was very popular at the time, and it's a very long-lasting material. To clean it today, because as you can see on the picture to the left, the picture on the left is the plaster is a little bit dirty, but this can be easily cleaned by just applying water with a karcher, but on a very low pressure in order to clean it all together, and it will get back brand new. Why? Because it's tinted in the mass. It's totally tinted. It's not a color that is applied on it. And apart from this Tyrolian finish, another finish imitating the stone is the bush hammer plaster with joints created in the plaster of the facade. The plaster in itself is colored as it is with it's white cement mixed with aggregates and powder, stone powder that will give the color, which is a yellowish ochre color. And then as soon as it is applied, the joints are drawn on the facade, and then we have teams of workers that will push, hammer totally the facade in order to give it the effect of the stone. So sometimes the base of the building is clad in stone, be it rough stone or polished smooth stone, but the facade itself is not totally clad in stone because it's very expensive and because stone is not a la mode, as we were saying. So what we use here is plaster that is colored to render the same effect as the stone. And we see that this was very popular also in the 1940s and 1950s. The first half of the 1950s, this type of finishing was very popular. We see here buildings that were built by Albert Manasseh, who was one of the major engineers and architects of the period. What is interesting is that I will go back. Albert Manasseh worked with this material in Ashrafiyya a lot, and the whole Tasween Tatwaini area is full of buildings that have the same finishing. All the buildings were not built by him, but he sort of imposed this as a finishing material, and it gives us a piece of really urban fabric that is coherent altogether, with really very nice buildings which have the same material. All were built in the early 1950s, so they are 70 years old now, and as you can see, all it needs is a very little restoration and cleaning, and it will get brand new. Another finishing material that was applied and very popular in the second part of the 1950s and all through the 1960s is what was called Kratz. Kratz is a type of plaster that was applied with a brush made out of nails on a piece of wood. So nails next all together as a brush on a piece of wood. The cement is applied on the wall, and then it is all worked on with these nails with the brush nails, nails brush actually, in order to render this very rough finishing. But because it was troweled very strongly with this, it's a very hard material, very long lasting, and totally adhering to the surface of the cement blocks or the concrete. And this also, to be cleaned, is cleaned by some Karcher applied at low pressure. And because also it's tinted within the mass of it, this plaster is very hard and very long lasting and doesn't need to be painted. And this, I'm saying it because, as you can see today, many engineers or architects, when they come to restoring such materials and they don't know, they will apply, they will paint it. And this is a catastrophe, because when you paint it, really, it defeats the purpose of this material, which is done as something that is here to last forever. And they played with the contrast between this smooth plaster and rough plaster Kratz to really indicate or compose the facade of the buildings. And sometimes this, by surprise, when I was restoring a building built in 1961 by my father, Dagher, I discovered that within the Kratz plaster, there were pieces of glass. So he has added crushed glass to the plaster, which, of course, under the sunlight, gave some brightness to the facade. Really interesting thing. Another thing that was done also with cement is the Terrazzo smooth polished plaster. Terrazzo, which is a mix of cement and fine gravel, was applied, of course, to the floor, as we know, the flooring in Terrazzo tiles, but also on the base of the walls, specifically in all the stairwells. It was applied on the walls, really very well applied. And this is also a very strong material, very long lasting. Because it's polished, it will resist very well the test of time, the hands all around, etc. Usually it was finished with a piece of wood on the top. And on the picture to the right, you see the contrast between the stone, the bush hammered plaster, and the smooth Terrazzo plaster, which was applied on a round column. So on a round column, the ideal material was really to apply this Terrazzo smooth polished to give it the effect of a granite marble. So it looks very much like granite. It's very solid again, but it's all made out of cement. Stone cladding started to be implemented in the 1950s, and then, of course, in the 1960s, late 1950s and early 1960s, in the really modernist era. Once we skip the Bauhaus and Art Deco influences, and we come into more modernist architecture. Here, we're talking about an architecture where the model is no longer the very classical building that we know, symmetrical, with spaces that were really very well expressed, and facades that were really consistent with whatever was existing inside. We see, as of the mid-1950s, architecture changes totally, with a play of planes and volumes in the space, and with also sometimes an expression where the building will be, the expression of the building, instead of being something heavily laying on the ground, will be, on the contrary, something in suspension in the air. So here, with the influence of Carol Shire in the architecture, and the craziness of Joseph Philippe Caram, who will play with this, appears a new way of playing with architecture, where volumes and planes will be playing, will be suspended in the air, and the notions of gravity and lightness are played with in a way to express materials, with materials, express another way of playing with architecture. So the stones, as you can see, are not necessarily built as bearing walls. They're not bearing walls. They're actually a play of material the stone is here used just to express a texture to the wall, and it's not at all no longer something that is holding the building. It's not structural, it's just aesthetical, although many times it was still used at the ground floor because it's still heavy. As you can see here, for instance, on these ground floors, but the stone is just a plane in the air. It's no longer a box. It's something that extends from inside to the outside. To the left, you have a picture from a building of Georges Reyes, where we see that the stone wall to the left is extending inside the gate of the building to the inside. And to the right, it's a building by Shire, the Filipides Villa, where also the walls inside and outside are in the same stone. So here we have planes in space, which are just interrupted by glass. Another feature of the late 1950s and early 1960s, the enamel glazed tiling that was introduced by Fuad Tabet and was very much used in Rauche by Joseph Philippe Karam, and later on, of course, influenced a lot of architects. These enamel glazed tiling with bright colors, sometimes bright colors, were used a lot, used as decorative patterns. And we see here that the Bauhaus was not able to maintain itself as a way of thinking for a very long time. And very soon, the architects needed to express themselves with decorative items. Some did it in a very sober way by using colors that were really consistent with the plaster colors, the ochre plaster colors in the background. But some others, therefore, used it with really very strong colors, primary colors, of course, in the building to the on the photo to the right, but also water green colors or blue colors. And as you can see, sometimes it's a feature that is applied and makes the facade, and sometimes it's just something to clad on specific elements like planters or like beams on top of the windows. However, we can see that some architects used it in a very daring way. The whole facade is an expression, an artistic expression, where with these enamel glazed tiles, pâte de verre, we call it pâte de verre in French. It's 2 by 2 very small pieces of tiles that are glazed and that are applied to the facades. On the picture to the right, we can see how really one major side of the building is totally clad with these materials, which is also a very strong and very long-lasting material, and can be cleaned also by applying water. But you have to be careful with something, because a strong jet of water can affect the glue. These were not applied with glue. It was applied on the plaster, which was still wet. And once the plaster was wet, these tiles were applied as pieces. Of course, it's not applied tile by tile, but it was assembled, factory assembled, and it came as large pieces, factory assembled, which were glued to the facade with cement. On the picture to the left, however, you can see that there is some sort of very modern composition on these glazed tiles. This modern composition is on a plane that is suspended in the air. It's like a piece of art that is applied to the facade, applied on the facade. And, sorry, I'm coming back. So as you can see, it's suspended in the air. It's a villa, I suppose. I'm not sure, but I suppose it was built by Joseph Philippe Karam. And here we can see other buildings where this the glazed tiles are applied on the pilotis, for instance, the round columns that are holding the buildings. So the pilotis floor is something that is really essential also of the late 1950s and early 1960s, in the sense that the whole building, the box of the building, is suspended in the air, by a void at the ground floor, suspended on small, supposedly small columns, very thin as possible, that were made round to be different from the heaviness of the angular structure that is above. And all of this, of course, to invert the idea that the building is heavy and has a very heavy load. Instead of heavily laying on the ground, it is suspended in the air and it defies the gravity. So as you can see, these were expressed in a different color than the building itself, and in a dark color just to disappear as much as possible to really be in the shade. However, on the picture to the right, we see that it was clad with green water green tiles. Another major element of the architecture of the 1950s and 1960s, modernist architecture, is the claustra. The claustra, which is practically a grill, sort of musharabiye, made out of concrete and cement to protect the view to the inside and to be used as a sunshade. But most of the time, the claustra, which is a precast cement elements, was applied on the service areas of the building to hide these areas, which were supposedly not primary areas, not to be seen, because at the time, of course, there was these service areas were not not to be seen, but were many times on the front facade of the building. So it was hidden by the claustras, and the claustras were a pretext to use playful motifs on the facade and to animate the facade. We can see many pictures here that show many models of these precast claustras, which are pieces of 20 by 20 precast cement modular elements that can be assembled, and once assembled, they create a pattern on the facade. Now, of course, each and every architect used it in his way. You can see on the picture in the center bottom, there is like a large area, a large opening that is all closed with those claustras. And to the right, you can see the view from inside. So from outside, you cannot see what's happening inside. It's all in the shade. Again, usually it's the service areas, but sometimes also it was used as a protection, and sometimes it was used just for the sake of composing the facade, like again Joseph Philippe Karam has done in Badaro of course, he got inspired by Carol Shire, who first used it in Hazmiye, the famous building in Hazmiye, but then Joseph Philippe Karam used it without using it as a sunshade or as a protection for the services. As you can see on the picture to the left, he alternates the claustras on the building, depending sometimes on the kitchen, sometimes on the living room. So it's a haphazard way of working, just to compose the facade in a funny way, in a playful way. And to the right, you can see how the claustra is expressed as something that is part of the mass of the building, and the balconies, which are the lighter part of the building, are expressed really as a contrast to the mass in which the claustras are carved out. Another claustra is done in tinted cement. So the cement is colored, instead of being plainly white, ochre, or gray, it's tinted here, for instance, in red ochre, to show that it's something that resembles the terracotta. But here, what's interesting in this building is that the claustra, as you can see, is detached from the building. It's not something that is in between two slabs. It's not something that is just closing a window, an opening in the wall. It is really an element in itself. And this villa, which is probably, as I was saying, by Joseph Philippe Karam, again, we can see this glazed tile composition to the right, that is suspended in the air, and the claustra wall is as well suspended in the air. As you can see on the bottom right photo, where the claustra is really on a steel structure, totally independent from the structure of the building, and it's like a mask that is applied to the building. So here we see how these elements that were originally should have had a function. The claustra is supposedly hiding the surfaces or protecting from the sun. It's becoming an element to decorate the facade. It's of course it is on the kitchen side, but it's also on the balcony on the balcony side as well. So it's a mix of functionalism and aestheticism. Another invention by our friend Joseph Philippe Karam. I'm using a lot of pictures from his buildings because he was really the most playful of all architects, not always worried about the coherence of the way he used things. The claustra on this service area is done of steel pipes. So the steel pipes are cut in modular elements and then cast in a large prefabricated claustra that is then applied to the facade, detached from the facade. Of course, you can see that there is a gap in between the claustra and the wall behind. But you can clearly see here the pieces of steel pipes that are incorporated within the cement. And of course, because the cement here is not, there is no steel reinforcement within the cement, it cannot hold. So it's little by little being detached. However, it's all framed together. So the pipes are framed within the large steel frame, and then the cement is poured inside, which allows it really to have some sort of structural coherence and solidity. Now, going back to another element. So how will the architects express themselves in this new architecture? Within the gates, of course. The gates are decorated in this molded cement, which is part of the facade. So the whole building looks like one monolithic element, where some elements are detached, of course, the gates, with sometimes the date of construction, which is expressed 1931, 1932. And within this gate, we see the steel, the steel gate, the steel door, which will have a very elaborate decorative importance. Of course, the most monumental and elaborate gateway of Beirut that I know of the 1930s is the Kratz building on Mosaic, where really, as you can see, it's very elaborate. The paving, the Carrara flooring outside, this is something absolutely new. It was never applied outside except on the balconies. And the gate, the steel gate with those animals expressed on it, typical of the Art Deco era. As we can see, there is a whole process here, starting from the fence to the inside with the tiling and the door, the glazed and steel door, all together, and the verandas on the side. Everything here is done in a way as to express really some sort of monumentality for the building. But as you can see, the expensive elements are the steel, the marble tiling on the floor, but otherwise all the rest is just cement. Cement that is painted in yellow. Other gates here, and as you can see, we're going from different styles from the 1920s to the 1950s. Some are very elaborate in terms of steel decoration. Some are typical of the Art Deco era. The concrete is always very important to frame the gate, frame the door. But you can see on the bottom, for instance, more simple details, very also emblematic of the 1920s and 1930s. Very simple details, also with colored cement, but the gate itself is in steel with very little details. Little by little, it goes to simplistic designs, while on the major, the big photo to the right, you can see how elaborate the design is, which is typical of the 1940s, influenced by a sort of decorative patterns that came back to light after the austerity and the rigidity and severity of the Bauhaus and Le Corbusier. Other examples of iron gates, all of these are here in Beirut, so you can see how elaborate these designs were. And sometimes you can even also, in the same neighborhood, you see many gates that look the same, which shows that not only the architects, but probably also the person who fabricated those doors was the same. The guardrails inside and on the stairs, on the balconies and on the stairs, of course, first of all, were elaborate in decoration because it was still the Art Deco decoration with curves, anything to change from the patterns that were used during the Ottoman era. So sometimes very vertical and rigid, but sometimes very curved as well. You can see to the right absolute Art Deco, exquisite Art Deco systems where the flat pieces of steel are used, creating patterns based on the thickness of the steel in facade. So with large parts and then lighter parts next to it. The two pictures that you see to the right are not on the same building. So it shows that really the system was also a system that was very much used and very graphic. So the architects and engineers worked on these graphic elements really to express themselves on very plain and very simple facades otherwise. And of course, little by little, the guardrails will go simpler and simpler with the decoration being lighter and then no decoration at all, just vertical lines, somehow with a little relief, or horizontal lines just to protect it plays its role without any sort of over decoration. Goes little by little to the simpler thing. It's not only aesthetical; it's also an economical, for economical reasons. The stairwells, of course, in the Art Deco period were still very important, very large stairwells and very elaborate. But however, the stone steps were replaced with cement steps with the same profile and the same design as the typical Furni cantilevered stairs, but these were produced in cement and applied in the same manner on the walls. And of course, the Terrazzo modernist stairs with Terrazzo finishing, precast Terrazzo steps applied on the floor. And at one point, of course, it will get to very light and very airy light wells and stairs, as you can see to the right, the Télé-Liban staircase. So the stairs were also the space where the architects and engineers could show their mastering of details in the way the connections are done between one slab and the others, as you can see. And this building shows it a lot. You see how all the connections are curved and connecting all together. So it's very elaborate, very well drawn, and of course not easy to fabricate on site, but because it was all done in cement, and here we're talking about the building of the early 1960s, so the plaster workers were really very strong and had the ability to produce such elements. As for the windows, we see that the windows that were originally vertical in the early 1920s will little by little shift towards horizontal and horizontality. You see in these three pictures how the first window is clearly vertical, the second is vertical but a little bit larger, the third to the right is not only more horizontal but also on a curved wall, on a round wall. So we see how it evolves. However, the shutters are still in the same pattern and still early on made of Kotrani wood, like it was done during the late Ottoman period, which is cedar from Lebanon, Cedrus Libani. But little by little, of course, because it was expensive and because it was not really available, they started to use sweet pine wood as complement to the Otran. And here we see how the window, little by little, is simply framed, so no longer cornices, elaborate cornices on top of it. It's just a cement frame, and the window from vertical starts being square and little by little more horizontal. Details of windows with rolling shutters. Here we have the rolling shutters that appears, and of course it's a major innovation, the rolling shutter. Why? Because it's much more practical. And also another window that appears with the horizontality is the sliding window, still produced in wood, but the sliding window in the 1950s and 1960s was a typical element of bedrooms and living rooms, mainly living rooms, of course, with the rolling shutter, which, as you can see on the window to the right, on the picture to the right, we have as well the sliding window that slides inside the stone. So there's just a gap in the stone, and it slides usually on a railing that is applied on the top. And the rolling shutter that is hidden on the facade, so we don't see it on the facade, and the box of the rolling shutter is inside the building, it's inside the room. Of course, all of this implies that the thickness of the wall should be around 30 centimeters, because you have at least 15 centimeters of drop beam to hide the rolling shutter, and then the 15 centimeters inside to have the window complex, and the box of the rolling shutter is always protruding from inside. As we can see, the finishing material is always and still very simple cement, but the windows are just a hole in the wall with horizontal lines implying that it's really a horizontal composition instead of the vertical composition of the previous time, and rolling shutters, which are really interesting because those rolling shutters are not only rolling, but also they can open out to create some sort of a sunbreaker on the outside. So you could open your shutter, still be in the shade, look at the street, have some air coming in with those type of windows and shutters that we call all'italienne, Italian style. Of course, wood, little by little, wood will be less and less employed, and steel windows will appear in the 1950s and all through the early 1960s before being also ruled out by aluminum. So the windows are made out of steel, very light and very thin pieces of steel with accessories that were imported, of course, from Europe, as you can see on all of this. But what's interesting in it is that really the steel was very light as compared to aluminum that we're using today, which is very thick. The profiles of aluminum are very thick, very unelegant. Of course, today there are new systems that are more elegant, but the steel was really creating some sort of a mesh on the facade, framing very lightly the glass. The tiling, of course, stone was still a very important source of floor tiling. They were cut on site by multiple stone masons who used to cut it on site in order to tile it, but not always as squares. Why? Because also influenced by the Italians and the Americans, we see new systems of tiling that appear in the stone, which we call today crazy paving, which are uneven forms of tiling that were assembled all together. The terrazzo tiling is the most popular and most, we can find it everywhere, in high end, in low end, in mid-scale, whatever. The terrazzo was the systematic type of tiling, which was called mosaic. Mosaic because it's a composition of cement with pieces of gravel, etc. And then the cement could be colored between white, green, black, yellow, red, whatever. And sometimes they used to put inside the terrazzo tiling pieces of different colors just to give it some some elaborate design. We see here the evolution between the cemento, which is the cement tiles produced in the 1920s and 1930s with geometric patterns or floral patterns assembled on the ground. And little by little, we see how the designs get simpler. You see from between the left and the right how the design gets simpler, simpler and simpler to finally very plain monocolor terrazzo tiling. And because it was assembled with gravel, sometimes they assembled also pieces of leftover marble inside, which was used mainly in the ground floor and entrance of the buildings to give it some elegance and some importance. But the base is also, again, cement mixed with pieces of stone. Another new material that is introduced is the stoneware ceramics. Stoneware ceramics, which is very hard and was imported from Europe, from Italy mainly. These ceramics are very thin, less than 1 centimeter, 8 millimeters usually, in very little pieces. Today, we know that we can produce very large pieces of ceramic, hardware, stoneware. However, at the time, it was very small pieces that were assembled either in plain color or in multiple color to give also some sort of decoration. As you can see on these pictures, sometimes they used to add in pieces of different colors just to give the idea that it's not really a simple, basic and dull flooring. And on the picture to the right, you can see that it's just one color that is applied all together everywhere, even on the skirting. So these are just 10 by 10 small pieces of stoneware ceramics that are glued on the ground. The accessories, the ironmongery, also is very important. Why am I showing you that? Because I think that these are really parts of the architecture. And the hardware is really important. As you can see in the design, all of these have very elegant shapes. Sometimes we don't find it anymore. We cannot find so elegant shapes and so nice fixtures. So I think it's important to keep them because all it needs is just maintenance and it can be reused in the restoration of those buildings instead of getting in some new pieces that are not at all adequate in terms of design. Also, the bathroom accessories and the electrical fixtures, of course, the electrical fixtures cannot be kept because they do not respect standards anymore, and it will be changed. However, look at those pieces to the right, the 4 pictures to the right. They show you how nicely looking, and how elaborate those pieces are. On the pictures to the left, however, you see bathroom fixtures that still can be used. These are very long-lasting, very solid, and very nice and good-looking. So there's no reason why one wouldn't need to use the sinks or the hangers that were used in those buildings. Of course, what I recommend is to collect these items, use them as much as possible. I'm talking about the bathroom fixtures. Of course, the plumbing, the air conditioning, everything that was not existing and exists today should have to be changed, updated. But whatever we're doing, we should do it always in a way as to respect the spirit of the original building. This is a picture. I will conclude with 2 pictures. This picture is a picture of a typical building of the 1930s, where I partly grew up because my grandmother used to live in this building, and it's no longer existing today. This is what's happening today with those buildings. Why? Because, again, there is no law of protection, and even it's not just about the law, it's also about a vision for the city and for the future, an urban vision for the city. The only vision that we have today is about the FAR, exploitation, more exploitation, build more and more and more. And we don't have a clear vision of what our city will be looking like. The buildings of the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s and 1960s were still buildings that were limited in height to 24 meters, thus leaving a city where the sunlight could penetrate, the wind could blow inside those buildings. And despite the different aspects of those buildings, they still all bear the same conscience and all the same relation to the site and to the context. While what we're building today, 50 years down the road, is higher, is more dense, more densified, and takes absolutely cares not at all for the historical urban fabric that was existing before. And of course, it's not only pieces of building that are demolished, but pieces of the memory, pieces of the tradition and the history and the heritage. Thank you very much for your attention. Should you have any questions, I'm open to answer them.
Thank you, Fadlallah. Very interesting presentation. So there are a few questions about the plaster. So is the Tyronian plaster or bush-hammered plaster still used nowadays?
Yes, of course. The Tyronian plaster, we call it today, we call it Rashet Mismar. Anyway, this is how any plaster has to be applied. It has to be applied, first of all, on a base course. The base course is this Rashet Mismar, which is the Tyronian plaster. Of course, you can apply more and more layers on it because it's quite a thick, if you want to have it as a render, it has a thick plaster of 3 and sometimes 4 centimeters. And you can, of course, mix different thicknesses of sand and gravel in it in order to give it texture more and more. Is it applied? It's very easy because, yes, the machines are still existing today to apply this Rashet Mismar. And then, of course, with a trowel, you can pass the trowel on it to smoothen up the surface and create the patches on the surface. So all it takes is just to use white cement, add the aggregates, the colored aggregates that you would like to see as a solid finishing, and then it's very easy. Maybe if you've never done it, I have done it on some of my projects. So I did it with people who didn't know how to apply it. Sometimes you would find some old plaster master who would still give you the recipe. But otherwise, you can try it on a wall on the side, and it's very easy and very fast doing. You would do some samples, some trials, and then, of course, apply it the way you want. So all it takes is just some plaster master who is ready to play it with you and do it with you. As for the bush hammered plaster, also, of course, it's done today. All you need is, of course, a big team of people, because once the plaster is applied to the wall, and it has to be a solid plaster that in white cement and also with aggregates inside, colored aggregates to give it color and the tint you will be willing to give. Then you have a big team before it's totally dry, not on the same day, but on the second day. So you need to leave it 24 hours to dry and to solidify a little bit, but not solidify too much. So once day down the road, 24 hours later, you will have all your workers with the bush hammer, the bushard. It's called in Arabic we call it bushard, the bushard. So these people will push hammer the surface of the plaster in order to get the adequate finish. Of course, you need people also, some people, foremen or anyone looking at the wall to master that this will all be done in the good and same pattern. The complexity of it, if it's too large, you will not be able to do it. So this is why they used to create joints on the facade, as you can see, either imitating stones or imitating larger panels, because in between those joints, you could apply the plaster and push hammer it, and then leave it to dry, and then use another one, and then another one. So it was not the whole wall that was bush hammered one stage, because otherwise you would need a huge team, and you need to do it very fast before it dries. It wouldn't work.
Thank you. The second question. So the claustra is a modern msharabiya, right?
Yes.
And is it still used?
Yes.
Sorry. Is it still used to cover small spaces like kitchens or bathrooms?
Well, it is, but it is not considered anymore. The cement claustra, the molded cement claustra, is not considered anymore as something fancy. Because today we have other materials like GRC, and mold and cast whatever you want in GRC and create the pattern you want. You have aluminum, you have steel, you have even 3D printers. So as we speak today, the materials that are available on the ground are so numerous that the palette is so large that nobody wants to use these old materials anymore. However, it's very flexible, very easy to manufacture and to use. So, of course, you can use it today. However, it depends on the pattern. Today, we see on the facades perforated mesh, perforated aluminum composite panels, etc., that are more fancy because, of course, whatever the architects want to express today with these new materials.
Thank you. So there is someone that's typing.
All these technologies we're talking about are very simple. Whatever was built in 1920s, 30s, 40s, 60s is very simple, and we can do it today because we're still using today the same technology of reinforced concrete and cement, plaster, and CME, etc., etc. So those buildings are very easy to renovate in terms of technicality. What is not easy is really to respect the facts of the material, to respect the spirit of the buildings, the spirit of the architecture. Really be careful about not changing the spirit. We have seen many buildings renovated lately with cladding that was applied instead of the plaster, texture plaster. And those cladding, of course, changed totally the spirit aspect of the building. It's not that we don't want to change that. However, adding a metal cladding to those buildings is not a good idea because we are in a country where the sun is quite warm. So these metal cladding will really have a big impact because either it will reflect, will absorb the heat a lot, and will, of course, affect the building. So what we're talking about, the cement plaster, the way it was applied, was a very solid and very resistant material, resistant towards the context, the geographic context, the sunlight, the rain, etc., etc. Those buildings have very little pathologies. Of course, the main pathology is the aging of the cement and the reinforced concrete.
Thank you. How do you feel about recycling these buildings to non-residential uses?
This is not an architectural issue. Of course, many of these buildings have been recycled to architectural users. It's not domestic anymore. We have many offices open in such buildings. The main problem of preserving those buildings is not how you are going to use them. Of course, adaptable reuse is something that we open up to, and it should be considered. The main issue is, however, that the Lebanese people always want to have new. They want to be a la mode, fancy. And in terms of services, these buildings have no parking. And as such, because there is no public transportation, it's very difficult to resist constructing new buildings because you cannot have an office building with no parkings in Lebanon if you don't have public transportation. So preserving those buildings, preserving the spirit of this city and the way it has grown in the last century is, again, as I said in the beginning, it's an urban question. It's a political question that should be addressed with really looking at the master planning of the cities in a different way. We have to support the city with public transportation, with public parking, getting it more and more a city for the pedestrian, as it used to be in the 1950s and 1960s, because people used to walk a lot. Car was not as dominant as it is today, because there was a public policy, not only a public policy, of course, because it was little by little, people didn't have the ability to buy so many cars, but it was not also politically supported as much as it is today, with a political system where the public system doesn't want to do anything and all is left to the public sector. So buy as many cars as you can and pay us your taxes, and that would be great. If you pollute, it's not a problem. If the roads are congested and there's a lot of traffic, it's not a problem. If there's no public parking, it's not a problem as well. So this is, unfortunately, the way the public authorities and municipal authorities have been dealing with this. And of course, with a proper municipality and a proper politic in the municipality council, and of course at a higher level, these systems should be implemented in a way as to preserve heritage. So preserving heritage is not just a decision as it has been talked of today, as a decision that comes from top down. We're going to preserve heritage and history. No, the idea is to preserve more than that. It's to preserve a way of living. It's to preserve our cities with green spaces, because all these buildings had also gardens on the front or on the backyard. Preserve gardens, preserve green areas, preserve the pedestrian areas of the city, and a more transparent, a more playful aspect of the city, rather than big monsters that are occupying all the space and shading on the traditional fabric.
Thank you very much. That's it for today.
Great. Thank you for attending this session. I'm sorry if I was a little bit long. And of course, it was, I couldn't show everything. I couldn't show everything I would want to show, because the period we're talking of is really such an interesting period in terms of creativity. But I wanted really to express the simplicity of the materials that were used and the finishes that were used. And this simplicity, of course, is complemented by the richness of the spaces. We can see in the architecture of architects like Cavreau in the 30s and 40s, like Shire in the 50s and 60s, Joseph-Philippe Karam, Georges Reyes, and others. I'm sorry if I'm not talking about each and every one. We can see how these architects always expressed very rich architecture, but with very poor material. What's interesting here is that the same material was used for the very basic, simple houses or buildings, and very elaborate buildings as well. So the question of material was not essential. It was the question of the space and the relation of this space with the globality, with the context, with the views, etc. That was important. And this is where really this architecture is really interesting and important. So thank you very much. And please look forward to the next manual, which will be a manual dedicated to modernist architecture from the 1920s to the 1960s, end of the 1960s. We're working on it now, and it will be out, well, whenever it will be out. And follow us, please. Always follow us on BHI, on all our presentations and communication. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Yasmin. See you soon.
Thank you, Fadlo. Our next presentation is about the urban heritage and the next steps for our urban heritage. It will be presented by Abdul Halim Jabir. We hope to see you there.